Welcome to English Avenue YouTube, the channel to learn English the easy way. Let's start. In one of the most dazzling and fast-paced cities in the world, a place where towering skyscrapers seem to pierce the heavens and the streets never truly slept, there lived a young man named Nathaniel. From the moment he was born, fate had bestowed upon him an existence of unimaginable privilege. He was the sole heir to a colossal fortune, built over generations by a family that had turned wealth into an empire. Yet, along with his inherited riches, Nathaniel had also developed an undeniable sense of superiority. He viewed himself as belonging to a different class, one untouchable, and above the common people who bustled through the city streets below. In his mind, money was the ultimate measure of worth, the currency that separated him from the ordinary lives of those who had to struggle for survival. His world was one of extravagance. Lavish parties hosted in opulent mansions, luxury cars that lined his private garage, and vacations to the most exotic corners of the earth, where he indulged in excess without a second thought. But despite all the glittering distractions that surrounded him, something vital was missing. His life, though coated in gold, felt hollow. He was surrounded by people, yet alone. Those who flattered him did so out of interest, and those he considered friends were merely companions who enjoyed the benefits of his wealth. True happiness, the kind that could not be bought, remained elusive. Something he had never sought because he believed his riches were enough. Yet deep down, in the quiet moments when the music faded and the champagne stopped flowing, there was an emptiness he refused to acknowledge. Despite being constantly surrounded by people who showered him with praise and admiration, Nathaniel knew deep down that none of them truly cared about him. They were drawn to his wealth, his power, the privileges that came with his name, but not to who he was as a person. In truth, no one even knew the real Nathaniel, because he had never allowed anyone to. He had built walls so high that even he had forgotten what it meant to genuinely connect with another soul. His world revolved solely around himself, and those who did not meet his expectations were simply beneath his notice, as insignificant as the noise of the city he ruled over. One afternoon, as he strolled leisurely through the bustling streets, basking in the admiration that followed him wherever he went, he came across an elderly man sitting on the sidewalk. The old man's clothes were ragged, his hands worn and calloused, his face lined with deep creases that spoke of years of hardship. His weary eyes, though dulled by suffering, still carried a silent plea for kindness. He extended a trembling hand, wordlessly asking for help, but Nathaniel's expression twisted into one of pure disdain. With a sneer curling on his lips, he halted in front of the beggar, looking down at him, as if his very presence tainted the street. "Get out of my way, old man," he spat, his voice laced with disgust. To him, this was nothing more than a pathetic sight, an inconvenience, something that did not belong in his pristine world. The very idea that someone like this would dare ask him for charity was almost offensive. The old man did not react. He did not beg, did not plead, nor did he even flinch at Nathaniel's cruel words. He simply looked at him, his gaze steady, filled with an eerie calm that unsettled something deep within Nathaniel's chest. There was no anger, no resentment, just an understanding far beyond what he could comprehend. That unreadable expression only fueled Nathaniel's arrogance further. How dare this man meet his gaze as if they were equals? With a smirk of disdain, he lifted his foot and kicked at the scattered coins lying in the old man's palm. The tiny pieces of metal clattered onto the pavement, rolling away into the dirt and filth of the street. "That's all you're worth," Nathaniel sneered, his voice dripping with cold amusement. He turned his back without another glance, walking away as if he had merely swept away a speck of dust. But he had barely taken a few steps when something strange happened. A sudden wave of dizziness overtook him, sharp and overwhelming, as if the ground beneath him had been pulled away. His vision blurred, the city sounds around him, honking cars, hurried footsteps, distant chatter, began to fade into an eerie silence. His breath caught in his throat as a strange, weightless sensation consumed him, as if he were being dragged into some unseen force. He staggered, trying to steady himself, but his body refused to obey. The world around him spun faster and faster, colors melting into one another, until there was nothing left but an abyss of darkness swallowing him whole. Then, everything went still. When Nathaniel's eyes fluttered open, he immediately knew he was no longer in the familiar streets of the city. The air was thick and heavy, carrying an eerie stillness that made his skin prickle. He found himself standing in the center of a vast, shadowed chamber, its towering walls barely visible in the dim glow of flickering torches. The flames cast long, distorted silhouettes against the stone, creating ghostly figures that loomed around him in complete silence. His heart pounded against his ribs as he turned his head, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Then from the darkness ahead something moved. A figure emerged, cloaked entirely in flowing black robes, its face hidden beneath the depths of a hood. The presence was neither man nor beast, and yet, it radiated an overwhelming authority that sent a chill down Nathaniel's spine. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to straighten his posture despite the fear creeping into his bones. "Where am I?" he demanded, his voice strained with an uncertainty he could not conceal. The figure remained motionless for a moment before speaking, its voice deep and resonant, filling every corner of the chamber with an undeniable power. "You stand before the tribunal of consequences," the entity declared, its words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Your life has been one of arrogance and cruelty. You have walked among others as if they were beneath you, casting aside their worth without a second thought. Now, you will face judgment for your actions and bear witness to the truth you have long ignored." Nathaniel's breath hitched. A cold dread settled over him, heavier than any burden he had ever known. He had always believed himself untouchable, immune to consequence. Yet, as he stood beneath the gaze of the faceless entity before him, he realized, for the first time in his life, that there was nowhere to run. Before Nathaniel could utter a word of protest, the cloaked figure lifted a hand, and suddenly, the air around him shimmered like rippling water. A silent force compelled him to watch as images began to form in the empty space before him. Scenes from his own life, each more damning than the last. He saw himself striding through the streets with his usual air of superiority, turning away from those who reached out in desperation. He watched as he sneered at the less fortunate, dismissing their suffering with cruel indifference. He saw the way his reckless spending and opulence stood in stark contrast to the struggles of those who had nothing. Each memory played out with unforgiving clarity, no longer dulled by arrogance or self-justification. For the first time, he was forced to witness the true impact of his actions. The pain in the eyes of those he had belittled, the quiet despair of those he had cast aside. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to look away, to shut his eyes and block out the unbearable truth, but he couldn't. The visions held him captive, forcing him to confront the man he had become. A tight knot formed in his throat, his chest heavy with an unfamiliar sensation: shame. "Do you feel no remorse?" The figure's voice thundered, reverberating through the chamber like a storm. Nathaniel's lips parted, but no words came out. A suffocating realization pressed down on him, more overwhelming than anything he had ever experienced. He had spent his life believing that wealth equated to worth, that power made him untouchable. But now, stripped of his illusions, all that remained was an empty shell. A man who had mistaken dominance for strength and self-importance for greatness. He tried to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper, but the weight of his past crushed him, stealing his breath. "Words are meaningless," the entity interrupted, its tone final and absolute. "Only actions can determine whether a soul is worthy of redemption." Nathaniel felt the crushing truth of those words deep in his bones. He had always believed that money could fix anything, that apologies could be bought. But here, in this place beyond the reach of his wealth, he realized that there were no shortcuts. If he wanted salvation, he would have to earn it. The tribunal presented him with two paths. He could continue living as he always had, indulging in his arrogance and selfishness, only to face an eternity of emptiness, or he could change, learn humility, abandon his pride, and dedicate his existence to repairing the damage he had inflicted upon others. Tears burned in Nathaniel's eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt the crushing weight of his choices, the unbearable realization that all his wealth and power had meant nothing. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, yet here he was, given a chance to rewrite his fate. His voice trembled, but his resolve was clear. "I want to change," he whispered, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his decision. "I don't want to be this person anymore." The moment the words left his lips, the chamber began to shift. The torches flickered wildly, and the shadows twisted as if unraveling from reality itself. A force pulled at him, spinning him through the void, the world around him collapsing and reforming at once. He felt himself falling, faster and faster, until suddenly everything stopped. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the tribunal. He was standing in the same street where he had once mocked the old man, the noise of the city roaring around him, as if nothing had happened. Yet something within him had changed. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as he looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers as if making sure they were real. He was alive. He had been given a second chance. His heart pounded as he turned around, his gaze scanning the street frantically. And then he saw him. The old man was still there, sitting on the cold pavement, his outstretched hand resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. This time, Nathaniel did not see a beggar. He did not see an inconvenience or a blemish on his pristine world. He saw a man, a human being, weathered by life but still holding on, still existing in a world that had turned its back on him. With no hesitation, Nathaniel walked toward him, then dropped to his knees on the pavement. His throat tightened as emotion surged through him, but he forced himself to speak, his voice raw and unsteady. "I'm sorry," he said, his words thick with sincerity. "I was blind. I was wrong, and I want to make it right." The old man studied him, his expression unreadable, but his silence no longer felt like condemnation. Nathaniel didn't expect forgiveness, didn't expect gratitude. For the first time in his life, he offered kindness with no strings attached. He reached into his pocket, but not for coins to toss at the man like scraps. This time, he extended his hand, offering help, offering respect. And in that moment, for the first time, Nathaniel felt something money had never given him. He felt human. From that day forward, Nathaniel abandoned the hollow existence he had once cherished. He no longer sought validation through extravagant displays of wealth, nor did he surround himself with people who only valued him for his fortune. Instead, he chose to use his resources for a purpose greater than himself. Rather than indulging in opulence, he invested in change. He built shelters for those who had nowhere to go, schools for children who had never known the privilege of education, and hospitals for those who had been long forgotten by society. His name, once synonymous with arrogance and excess, gradually became one that inspired hope. No longer was he the selfish young man who had once scorned the less fortunate. He became a man of kindness, of generosity, of true compassion. At first, many doubted him. They questioned whether his transformation was genuine, whether a man so consumed by his own ego could truly change. But as time passed, Nathaniel's actions spoke louder than any words ever could. He no longer sought recognition or admiration. He worked in silence, finding purpose in the simple, honest joy of giving. And as he watched the light return to the eyes of those he had once ignored, he felt something foreign yet deeply fulfilling bloom in his chest. He had spent years believing that happiness came from wealth, from possessions, from status. But now, standing among the very people he had once dismissed, he realized that the richest man was not the one who owned the most, but the one who gave the most. True fulfillment, he learned, came not from the things he could buy, but from the lives he could change. With each act of kindness, each hand he lifted from despair, Nathaniel felt himself healing, piece by piece. He had spent his life blind to the suffering around him, but now he saw with clarity. He had walked a path paved with mistakes, with arrogance and regret. But redemption, he realized, was not found in erasing the past. It was found in using the past to shape a better future. And so, Nathaniel embraced his new path, knowing that his greatest legacy would not be the empire he had inherited, but the lives he had touched. He had once been lost, drowning in his own emptiness, but now, he had found something far greater than wealth. He had found his purpose,